Welcome to this new edition of Rhodes Ahead, a series on thought leadership in the Rhodes community. I'm Elizabeth Quiche, the Warden of Rhodes House, and I am thrilled today to get a chance to speak to Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. Nick is a Rhodes Scholar whose work I have admired for now over 3 decades, a remarkable journalist who has truly lifted up such important stories for his readership with the New York Times. And I've also very much admired Nick and Sheryl for being one of my favorite power couples. Nick, as I mentioned, is a journalist, but he's a Rhodes Scholar, 1981, Oregon and Magdalen. And has been an editorial columnist with the New York Times. Sheryl is both a businesswoman and a former journalist, but the two of them have written 4 books and have a 5th one coming out. They also made history by being the first ever couple to win a Pulitzer Prize. That was for your joint work, journalism work on the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. Nick then went on to win a 2nd Pulitzer for your work covering the Darfur genocide. And you have written 4 books together, a 5th one on the way, one which was a #1 New York Times bestseller, Half the Sky. It's right here, actually, on my shelf.
We like that product placement.
An absolutely extraordinary book about both the oppression of women, but also women's activism and leadership in as you say in the book, the most important freedom movement of the 21st century, the emancipation and empowerment of women. You also then jointly wrote, it's called A Path Appears, about the power of philanthropy, and I believe 2 books on Asia.
That's right.
You wrote China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia. And you have a new book coming out in January called Tightrope. So I think I want to begin by asking you about that. What is Tightrope about? How did that book come about?
So Tightrope is about the disintegration of working class communities in the U.S. And part of it was that Sheryl and I would travel around the world and highlight global problems. And then meanwhile, we would periodically go back to the farm town that I grew up in, Yamhill, Oregon. And it was profoundly struggling. Lost jobs, drugs, broken families, and a community that I deeply loved just was going through desperate times. And so Tightrope is the story of that across America, told partly through the kids on my old school bus, a quarter of whom are no longer with us because of drugs, alcohol, suicide, and trying to find lessons in that and what can we do to address these problems more broadly. President Trump will at some point have moved on. These problems will still be with us and we need to address them.
But it's also about hope in many ways, very similar to Half the Sky, where it was about oppression and opportunity for women worldwide. This is really also about oppression and opportunity for Americans in this country. Because while there are people who are dying from their opioid addiction or struggling with alcoholism or just, devastated and want to commit suicide. These are like what we call the deaths of despair, which is really lowering the overall country's level of life expectancy. In many ways, if you can empower these people, they can really help unleash the economic power that America needs to continue in order to maintain its #1 position in the world. I mean, if you think about, if we're looking at competing with China, with India, these are growing, dynamic, large populations. In America, we obviously don't have as many people there, but if we don't have every American fighting for that economic might and that economic, progress, we will be much farther behind.
Yes. So are there lessons from other countries, given how much you all do travel around the world, as particularly other industrial or post-industrial countries, for how you can move that needle?
Yeah, I mean, look, these are global problems. So automation, industrialization, globalization. They took jobs away from all kinds of countries. And so, for example, we looked at what happened to auto workers who lost their jobs both in Detroit and right across the border in Windsor in Canada. And those who lost their jobs on the Canadian side ended up being much better off because Canada had a strong program to retrain workers, to push them into new jobs in healthcare, in other areas that were likely to provide new jobs in the coming decades. And so, at the end of the day, while these are global problems, it's the workers in Detroit who are much more likely today to be struggling with addictions, to have had a family breakup, while those on the Windsor side, they've had their struggles too, but it turns out the government actually can do things to mitigate the damage and to provide help.
And it's also important that we don't think that we need to coddle these people. It's not as though that any kind of subsidies or welfare is meant to just make it so that they can just sit on their couches all day. It really is to just give them assistance so that they can actually get a leg up and continue to climb the ladder. And competition is still very, very important because, right now there's a push against immigration because people don't like the fact that there are other immigrants who are willing to work for less and to work a lot harder and take away their jobs. Well, it's okay to have that competition if you also can give these people some assistance so that they can actually get back into the game and give them encouragement and some sort of confidence level that they actually can get back into the game. It's when you actually take those, potential levers or this potential assistance away from them that they start thinking there's no hope, therefore I am against any kind of immigration.
Yeah, it's so interesting, that notion of a community kind of losing its that there's such a enterprising spirit historically in a lot of America. I know both of you are in different ways the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, because you're third generation.
Third generation, so
yes.
grandchildren.
But I know, Nick, your father
Dad was a refugee.
A refugee, as were my parents, were refugees from similar part of the world, Hungary and Romania, I think, is where your father was from. But there's such a proud tradition in America of refugees, immigrants, and native-born Americans. With this great kind of enterprising spirit. So I'm really looking forward to the book and to the ways in which it speaks to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find it's been really sad the way some of the dysfunction in the U.S. has led to really harsh attitudes toward bigotry, and I think back to the 1960s, and America was willing, I think, at that point to pass civil rights legislation to make a little more room at the table, because there was a perception among the working class communities that they were rising, and they were, as a result, a little more willing to accept space for somebody else at the table. And now I think a lot of Americans feel that is not happening, and so they become, it's easier in that context to fall prey to demagoguery and bigotry.
That's right. That's right.
I think one of the things that many Americans don't realize, people who are educated and who are really kind of at the top of the income ladder, is that they don't realize the pain and the suffering and the dysfunction that a lot of Americans are actually going through now. Even though we have this booming economy, we have the lowest unemployment in a long time, there are still people who are extremely down in the dumps, really just trying to make ends meet, just can't even see beyond a month where they're going to be, where their food is going to come, where the money is going to come to pay their bills. And there are a lot more people like that. And inside their households, we were able to get inside the households of some of these people. The dysfunction is just unbelievable. I mean, it's just something, it's almost like a different world, that these are Americans. You just can't believe that they are Americans. At the same time, what we're arguing is that we do want to bring these stories to readers, because it's so important to understand that there are Americans suffering in this way. But we are also asking not just for handouts, but for a morality of grace. I mean, some kind of understanding that, they may be going through hard times, but because we are a society, we have some sort of social contract, we want to help our fellow Americans so that all Americans can be lifted up, because we actually, are disadvantaged. each of us Americans, we are disadvantaged when the entire nation is held back. Yes. I mean, we are so much better as a nation when all Americans actually can be, putting their best foot forward. I mean, we benefit. I mean, when everyone is doing better.
Yes, and it's not a zero-sum game. In fact, and frankly, with demographics being what they are, we need more young people, who are engaged in the economy, who are thriving, in order to take care of us when we get old.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd love to ask the two of you about this amazing project that you've been on of writing together. How does that work? How did it come about? How did you first start to realize that this could be part of your life's work?
Well, we never looked at it that way. We sort of, it just happened very naturally. After we were living in China, we had, foreign correspondent postings in China. And then people were asking us, aren't you going to write a book? Aren't you going to write a book? And so we thought, well, there's a lot more to say that we actually couldn't say, in 700-word stories for the newspaper. So we actually decided to write a book. And it worked out very well. We each had different experiences that we brought to bear. We, wrote separate chapters each. We alternated. It worked very well. And so then we sort of used that as the blueprint for writing other books together. We had a similar experience when we were both correspondents in Tokyo, based in Tokyo, covering different parts of Asia, different aspects of the Asian financial crisis and what was going on in Korea, in Japan, and in parts of Southeast Asia as well. And so we used that again as sort of the platform to write Thunder from the East. And then when we came back to the U.S., I went over to the business side, and Nick actually then started writing as a columnist around the world. And so the idea of Half the Sky came about partly from our days in China, where we had seen that Chinese women were oppressed, but we thought, China is a giant country. It's full of good and evil. It's the full spectrum. And what we saw in China with regard to women, well, that's just China, right? That's China's unusual. Then we moved to Japan, and of course Japan we saw, of course, the word for wife, oksan, means back of the house. I mean, you're in the back of the house, and so that we also saw there was some kind of discrimination against women there. So we thought, oh well, this is Japan, it happens in South Korea, it's just Asia. So I thought, that's just Asia. So then when Nick started traveling to the rest of the world, Africa, all these other parts, gosh, it's all over the world. We just didn't know this. And so that's when we started thinking maybe this is a global thing, and that became Half the Sky.
Wow, that's great.
The subtext of your question, I thought, Elizabeth, was, how do you guys write books together and stay married?
Indeed.
And the truth is that, so we have 3 kids, mm-hmm. and if you can have kids together and stay married, then a book is a piece of cake. You can put a book manuscript to bed at night and it stays asleep.
Right.
A manuscript doesn't play you off each other. And so we found that if we could figure out raising kids, then the manuscripts, and also the stakes are lower if you screw up.
It also helps that we're both journalists. We know that other people edit your work. So
right,
it's okay.
Right. Oh, that's. But I think it's absolutely wonderful, and it sounds like you have a division of labor of actually dividing up the chapters, which is interesting.
Well, we actually in the subsequent, we varied. Actually, we've changed the way we write books together, so it's developed over time. So mm-hmm. There's no one formula.
Right, that's great. Yeah, the other ultimate marital test, I think, is co-teaching a class, which Jeff and I have done. So that's
cool. And you survived.
And we survived. So,
and the students survived too.
And the students survived, indeed. So I'm interested in your thoughts on journalism. And Nick, Nick just gave a talk to scholars on kind of the state of journalism today in American democracy. A really wonderful talk. But I'm also interested because Sheryl, you have worked on the business side of the New York Times earlier in your career, and you were laying out in your comments, Nick, how the business model in journalism is under so much stress right now, and added to that are these political are the political attacks on the media. So I'd love to hear both of you talk about, your sense of where the media is going. How do you see it threading the needle, and what's perhaps the most hopeful and least hopeful future that you see for journalism?
Well, one problem is the credibility of the media right now, and that both on left and right, although particularly on the right, we are indeed now often seen by a lot of people as fake news. As we speak, the President of the United States has just canceled subscriptions to the New York Times and Washington Post at federal agencies. And so there is a real trust problem that we have, especially on the right, although also to some degree on the left. And then I'd say the even larger problem is this one of our business model that has really collapsed. And now to some degree, the New York Times and other national papers have figured out a new model. But for local papers, there really isn't an obvious one. And it is so important that towns and cities across the country do have some kind of way to pay for what they do. And we haven't figured out what that is going to be. I also worry that to the extent that a business model is emerging for some mainstream organizations, then it's to cover politics, it's to cover kind of mainstream news. It's not necessarily to cover international affairs. And I happened to write back-to-back columns once from a trip to Syria, a trip to Yemen, and a piece about Brett Kavanaugh that I did from my desk quickly. And I was struck that the Kavanaugh column got far, far, far more page views than the Yemen column. And, the problem is that no editor in their right mind would send people off to cover Yemen. It's expensive, it's dangerous, and we haven't figured out how to get stories like that before readers. And Sheryl, she's been wrestling with the business model for a long time.
Yeah, no, I think it's really unusual because you've got, on the one hand, the death of local papers. On the other hand, you also have people caring only about local. We don't care, Americans don't care about what's going on in Yemen, but they do care about what's going on in their own backyard. But they also care about what's going on in the national news. But their backyard is still very important. The key is we have to figure out how to get enough payments that Facebook and Google have not taken away, all the potential money that would go into those kind of organizations. And so the one possibility is that Google and Facebook have to step up, because if they take away all of the advertising that would normally go to local organizations, then there may be a backlash, or that there will be some kind of retribution against them. Already we're beginning to see a little bit of backlash among users, of certainly Facebook. You're not getting it among the advertisers, which is really important, but you're getting a lot of protest. People are angry that Facebook is becoming so acting like a monopoly. And Google's been able to slide under the rug, but I think at some point it's going to come to them as well. The other thing that you're seeing now in the newspaper industry is that, and I say mainly newspapers because television still has a lot going for it right now, but it's really the news part of the industry that is really suffering. And in some ways, television news is also under a little bit of a battle, not as much as the newspapers. But you also are seeing people coming to the rescue. So you're getting deep-pocketed, billionaires and entrepreneurs coming to step in. We've seen Jeff Bezos buying, the Washington Post, and that helps because then he can start investing in, newer technologies, and that's helped the Wash Post because now what's happening is that they've created a user system, a technology system that they might be able to sell to other newspapers. It's not clear that they will be able to, but they may be able to roll it out because they've, modernize their technology in the way that you publish news stories, in the way that you actually get advertisers on, and then they might be able to roll that out in a cheaper fashion to other newspapers. Maybe that will allow newspapers to be on a cheaper platform platform that will then be more economical for them. Then you've got the LA Times, actually you had another billionaire entrepreneur step in and buy up the LA Times, and they're experimenting with different things, and hopefully that they will be able to revive the LA Times as well. So I think there's a lot of encouragement. And then you've got other models. You've got the nonprofit model. So ProPublica now has decided that we're a nonprofit, and so we'll raise donations. That can't work for a lot of people. There's only probably room for a few of them in the country because there just aren't enough dollars to go into that kind of model. But people are just trying to, find ways that will work for their brand of journalism. So local journalism still needs a fix. But I'm hopeful because, if the Milwaukee Bucks, could go from the last place in the industry to the first place, this is a home, sports team that you think, how could they ever move from last place to first? There must be, a way that local newspapers can, innovate to actually just survive and publish news that people do want to read.
Absolutely, and what I'm hearing is also this kind of proliferation of models, and so it's this period of disruption, and so hopefully out of that will come some sustainable models. I've just spent 12 years in Atlanta, where the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has sustained that kind of investigative journalism element, and but that is, as you said, Nick, it's really expensive to do that. It's very expensive to do international coverage. So it's figuring out ways to do that, to find the revenue streams to support it, maybe new platforms, as you were saying. I guess there's also this maybe more this kind of deeper human issue of which from your example of the coverage of Yemen and the coverage of Brett Kavanaugh, two very important stories. But you think about the scale of human suffering in Yemen, and yet it's hard to get people to pay attention. And I guess a lot of your work, Nick, has been about trying to get people to pay attention to what's happening around the world, to the places of the kind of greatest violence, greatest struggle. And I'd just love to hear you talk a bit about what have you learned from that? While the challenges continue to be present, but you have sustained a career which to a large extent focuses on those kinds of stories. What have you learned about how to tell those stories in a way that perhaps resonates more than it otherwise would?
So I wish I had cracked that code, and I'm still wrestling with it. When I was covering Darfur, it was really troubling that, at that time, New York City was all up in arms about these two hawks that had been pushed out of their nest in an apartment building next to Central Park. And all New York is up in arms about these two hawks that are homeless. And I can't generate the same outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered. And so that led me to the research and scholarship on what makes us care. And essentially it's about individual stories that we are not hardwired to care about masses of people or populations, but we can show empathy toward individuals. And so part of it is a matter of telling stories and reeling people in, and then once you have their attention on this person's story, then slowly expanding it to the larger problem. And so we try to do that. And then also showing that if people do engage with a problem, then they can make a difference. It is not hopeless. And I do think that one problem that we in journalism make, one way in which we err, and also the human rights and humanitarian community, is that we're always so focused on the problems that we don't adequately acknowledge that there is progress as well. And I think we can do better on that. But Elizabeth, I got to say, it is really frustrating to be jumping up and down about some problem that I go and report on and see and find outrageous, and it's very hard to get people to engage.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other problem is that we have a president who just sucks up all of the energy in
Yes.
any room he walks into, and so
Yeah.
it makes it really difficult to get airtime on anything.
Yes.
You know, so.
Yeah, no, and I know. I mean, you've been very creative about inviting young people to come and apply to go and do field reporting with you. Talk about that.
Sure. So, I mean, I've tried all kinds of kind of gimmicks to see what I can do to get people to care more. So, I've traveled with a video journalist, and we've done videos. I've used social media a lot to try to get people to, you know, if they won't read a column about Yemen, well, how about here's an Instagram photo that I took in Yemen. And also, when I was covering Darfur, I began a contest where I would win a trip contest where I'd take a student with me on a reporting trip. And the idea was that the competition would arouse some interest in these issues, and then the student would come with me and report and write in the New York Times, and that other students, other young people might be more engaged with what a student is writing with fresh eyes than what some old geezer is writing. And so we've done that since 2006, and I think that has, has been one tactic that at the margin has helped a little bit. I've tried, well, with our books, we also did documentaries for PBS with actresses to try to bring more attention to these issues. We had a Facebook game that had more than 1 million players. Covering Darfur, I dragged George Clooney along on a trip on the theory that people might not care about Darfuris, but if they were glued on George Clooney and he happened to be in Darfur, that would at least bring some attention to it. And there's a fine balance here, because you don't want to cheapen causes that you deeply care about. But on the other hand, you do want to try to figure out how you can engage audiences in issues that it's not intuitive to care about.
And newspapers are doing this too. I mean, that's partly what's behind all the events that they're trying to stage, because, that brings people into the idea of what the newspaper's about the news. You talk about the issues, people get more involved and they want to learn more and read your paper. And we do want society to be much more focused on, what is going on, that you want to educate them to the level where they can actually engage in, these issues and help solve these problems. And so I think it's important for, newspapers used to just be, here's the newspaper. But now they're, really trying to play roles in their local communities. And I think that's really important. Certainly the New York Times now, the events that they hold are an incredibly important part of what they do. And you see that among all of the major newspapers.
Yes, yeah, and it's happening. I know, like Chronicle of Higher Education is doing that as well. So that's one of those kind of innovative moves by the media. I mean, I do want to say to this point about journalism often lifting up the mirror to problems, but not giving people a sense of how they can do something. It's one of the things I really appreciate about Half the Sky is that your last chapter is very concretely about here are ways,
Right.
Here are organizations you can support, here are concrete ways in which you can make a difference. And I think that is an inspiring way to engage people, where you give them a pathway forward.
That's right. I think one of the failures in journalism is that readers really do want, after they've read about something, they want to do something. And we traditionally have flinched from scratching that itch. We felt that's not quite journalistic. And I think we need to rethink that. And as you say in our books, we've tried to do that. Our new book, Tightrope, actually, we end likewise with similar suggestions for practical things people can do.
That's great. That is great. So, Nick, I want to ask you about a little bit about your Rhodes experience. You've been a very engaged Rhodes senior scholar or alumnus. You are on the Association of American Rhodes Scholars Board. You've spoken at Bon Voyage. You've come here to Rhodes House to moderate a retreat, all of which is deeply appreciated. And you're a donor, which is also very much appreciated. And I'd like to hear your reflections on kind of the impact of the Rhodes Scholarship in your life, and maybe if you have thoughts on how Rhodes can be even more meaningful for alumni. would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think for me, as for many people, the Rhodes Scholarship was enormously important, not so much for what I actually learned in Oxford. I studied law, and I am not practicing law a lot here. My travels were a hugely important part of my time at Oxford. But I think also the friendships that I made, the intellectual awareness that I gained. I encountered Sir Isaiah Berlin, who became my intellectual hero, if you will, when I was here. And one of the challenges for employers in the U.S. is that there are a lot of really talented young people and not a lot of ways to figure out who they should hire. And a Rhodes Scholarship is actually one of those badges that you have on your resume that sets you apart. And so I think one of the reasons the New York Times hired me in 1984 was the Rhodes Scholarship. It was kind of a stamp of approval. And I'm just delighted that Rhodes House and that the Rhodes Scholarship has become a lifelong scholarship or activity, and not just one stint that you fill at Oxford for a few years. I've, on the giving side, I've also, Sheryl and I have weighed, the fact that we believe deeply in some global causes about, malaria, vaccinations, ways in which you can save lives for very inexpensive amounts. And so you think, how do you weigh buying bed nets to fight malaria against donations to the Rhodes Trust, which at the end of the day are not directly going to save lives? And our own thinking about that has been that much of our giving should be profoundly cost-effective and focused on the neediest, but one should also look at one's life experience and try to give back to sources that change one's own life. And my college did that, the Rhodes community did that, and I think that as my life was transformed by my time here, so others can be as well. And so that's how I kind of think through the philanthropy.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think, I guess the other piece that is so clear from all of the stories that you cover is the importance of ethical leadership and kind of cross-cultural knowledge in the world. And that's certainly one of the things that I think investing in the Rhodes experience
absolutely
does.
And it's I admire the fact that the scholarship, there are a lot of scholarships that focus on academic brilliance, and the emphasis within the Rhodes community on the world's fight, I think, is a really powerful element to it. Yes,
kind of the soul of the scholarship being that, and it can be it's a goad, it's an inspiration, it's a burden, it's all of those things.
Exactly.
So, last question. We were talking before we began the videotaped interview about the real interest among Rhodes Scholars in how you kind of forge a good life, and as part of that, successful marriages, how, you create models of equal partnership that are still quite novel in the world. I mean, we're, among the first generations where men and women are trying to, or same-sex couples are trying to forge equitable partnerships. The two of you are a wonderful example of that. And I'd just love to hear your reflections, any advice that you have, not only to Rhodes Scholars, but to kind of young people today of how you create an enduring bond where you're doing meaningful work together. You both have successful careers. You've brought up 3 fabulous kids. How'd you do it? What's your advice?
I'm not going to butt in on this one before Sheryl.
Well, I really think there's no formula. It's really just to be very flexible and to, at least know what the goal, is, at all times. I mean, I was lucky because in my family, my parents, my mom, was a very dynamic person, and she was never going to be like, put in the back of the house. Right? And so she was a very powerful, very strong woman. And so, I always saw that women were strong. I never for a moment thought, oh, women are weak, because she was like this. She's 4'11", but she was a powerful woman. She's the kind of woman who, when, she used to teach middle school kids in the public school system in New York City, and when one girl brought in a knife and pulled it out in class, here's this 4'11" woman screaming, said, "How dare you pull out that knife? Give it to me!" And she grabbed the knife. So that really put me on, and my sisters on a strong footing. So I think that really helped. But I think also what's really important is that you just have, there's so much give and take. I mean, in any kind of relationship, if people are going to be, rising at one point, not rising another, you just have to be able to go with the flow in a relationship. And it can't be always, okay, I have to have this 50%. I mean, you're not going to divide the housework 50%. It's just not going to work like that. But you just have to say, okay, yeah, I'll do more of the housework. You take out the garbage. I mean, that's fine. And I think that a lot of that understanding is part of friendship and, lifelong partnership. And, even with raising the kids, it was always, okay, Nick's good at this, and then I'm good at that. So it's not like I have to have 50% of that kind of, teaching or whatever. But it's more that this is where I'll help them. So I think that's really important to understand. It's hard to know before you engage in a relationship like that, but I think it works out, as you listen hard, that you can be successful if you try it that way.
That's very wise. Nick, anything to add?
I was sort of laughing to myself because Sheryl was talking about our division of labor, raising the kids, and I think that Sheryl would say, and actually a lot of wives would say, that the husbands are good at telling the kids yes, and it's the moms who are left with saying no. I think that that's true. And look, we have really tried consciously to forge a equal relationship, and it has been work, but there are still lots of elements in our lives that are profoundly unequal. I mean, when we drive, I'm the one who overwhelmingly drives. Cooking is way disproportionately Sheryl, but this is kind of what has worked in our life for us, and I think every couple has to think that through and work that out and talk about it. And I want to say that...
Who wants to eat his food anyway?
Oh, I was just thinking, sort of, yes. that there could be a quality question,
Yes, exactly. From each according to his ability.
Exactly.
But I think back to when my cohort was scholars, and everybody was deeply ambitious and thinking about how they could go and change the world and have an impact. And they wrestled with issues about what discipline to pursue, what degree to pursue, what job to take. I don't think that we adequately appreciated that the decision that would have much more impact on our role in the world was none of that, but was with the partner we would choose. And that ultimately that matters more than anything. I suspect that I'm thinking aloud here, but I suspect that is disproportionately true for women, because women still have more of a challenge combining childbearing, for example, with careers, and it matters hugely if your partner is going to be helpful and supportive on that front. And I don't think that we appreciated that at the time, and it's not just a question of the division of jobs; it's a question of the emotional support. And everybody is going to have setbacks and crises and kids who just at times behave crazily, and it is so important at that point to have somebody you can count on and who will, revive you to get back in the fight. When we were based in China, and we were being tailed everywhere we went, and we saw the Tiananmen massacre. It was a really difficult time, and I remember I got a Chinese painting of winter and these bare branches and snow and these two little birds cuddling together at the end of the branch, which we have in our bedroom. And I kind of felt like that was us at times, and we really needed each other.
Yes. Well, that's beautiful. That is beautiful that you have forged this lifelong friendship, have supported each other through good times and bad, have produced beautiful work together that is making a difference in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheryl and Nick. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you all for joining us for Rhodes Ahead with Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great.